Include Progressive, with small business insurance for protecting a variety of business types with multiple coverage options, designed to fit business owners' needs. More about small business insurance is at progressivecommercial.com.
Oh yeah, we're back for another week of Studio 2. Hello everybody, I'm Avi Wolfman-Arndt.
And I'm Cherry Gregg. Hello. So, Avi.
Yes.
You've probably been following the headlines like
That's my job,
have.
so yes.
And we all know the Trump administration has launched an aggressive campaign targeting higher education. More than 50 institutions, including University of Delaware and Rutgers, are under federal scrutiny for their DEI policies and responses to campus protests. The Trump administration has frozen grants. They have slashed federal aid programs. They've warned universities that non-compliance could result in losing millions in funding. So critics argue that these moves against universities are politically motivated attempts to reshape higher ed. And supporters say, look, universities have become too liberal and too exclusive and too reliant on federal dollars. So today we're going to look into why higher ed is in this crosshairs, a part of this political attack, and what's at stake for students, what's at stake for faculty and the country. We'll hear from an insider who has been the head of multiple public universities. We'll also hear from two experts with differing viewpoints on the subject. And our question of the day for you, our listeners, is this. Have universities and colleges become too liberal? We want to hear your thoughts on this. You can call 888-477-9499. You can email studio2@whyy.org. And if you're watching on YouTube, hi, tubers. Be sure to drop your comment in the chat. Lots to talk about.
Lots to talk about.
I know you were very interested in this topic.
I am. Do you think your alma mater will come up in this conversation? Any of your alma maters?
We'll see.
Yeah.
BU, Howard Law, and Temple.
Yeah.
We'll see.
We'll see.
Yeah. You Haverford?
Haverford College.
You think?
And I did get a 1-year degrey from Columbia University,
Which
is
my goodness,
already part of the conversation.
Already part of the conversation. You went to. You're so smart.
I don't know about that. I think
I know
people would
now
say,
with the attacks.
some people would say it's actually not a sign of intelligence to get into these schools.
Yeah, I
so
guess
we're going to
so.
talk about it
guess
today.
so.
But first, we're going to talk about a trio of local news stories, starting with the story that came from the Inquirer about Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro. So recently, we talked about the fact that he was put on the Cape, saying he was a hero, claiming he helped unfreeze $2.1 billion in federal funding by going to the White House, having a chat with the folks of the Trump administration, and getting that funding unfrozen. But recently, a staffer, a communications staffer with the Trump administration says that narrative is a big old lie, that basically Shapiro had nothing to do with this. It was an unusually strident response, given that the claim is the type of claim that politicians do make a lot. Hey, I did this, I did that, I was instrumental. Sometimes those claims can be elevated. But someone with the Trump administration told the Inquirer that this is not what happened, that the funds were unfrozen for reasons unrelated to Josh Shapiro. So now a little tiff spilling out into the press between the governor of Pennsylvania and the White House.
Yeah, I mean, what stood out to me, number one, publicly calling a governor a liar is harsh, because people can tend to differ on who was more influential, like you said, but calling someone an outright liar, that's a lot. But also, it stood out to me that Pennsylvania's budget relies heavily on federal funding.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, 40% of its annual spending comes from federal funds, $50 billion for the upcoming fiscal year. So Pennsylvania needs that money. And so hopefully this won't bubble up into a bigger tiff that could impact the bottom line.
Yeah, story number 2 now. Speaking of money, certainly some sort of money fight brewing at the Community College of Philadelphia. Cherry, tell us about that.
Yeah, after a year of stalled contract negotiations, on Monday, AFT Local 2026 at Community College of Philadelphia voted 97% in favor of authorizing a strike. So to be clear, they're not currently on strike. They simply authorized one. Let me explain. The union is demanding higher wages. They want improved staffing and free public transit access for students. And the members have been extremely disappointed with recent bargaining sessions with with CCP. They claim that CCP's offers did not adequately address their demands. And when it comes to pay, they said there's a big disparity.
Yeah.
Adjunct professors teaching similar classes at schools like Temple get 25% more pay, and they think that's wrong. Also, they say there needs to be more staff, like more advisors, counselors, librarians, to serve students better because there's a lot of workload pressures. And finally, students have joined in the fight because they want free SAPTA passes.
Is it just me, or do you think CCP is like the most important institution, at least higher education institution in this city, that I feel like no one ever talks about?
Yeah, it's very important.
Big. It educates so many students. It's a stepping stone for so many. And so, of course, we all hope that this gets worked out somehow and that both sides get what they feel like they want or they need, because a lot of students could be left in the lurch here. But it just reminds me of CCP's, vital importance to the city. I mean, it's a huge institution.
Yes. It makes, higher education accessible and affordable for so many people. And this goes into the bigger issues with higher ed. I mean, it's so expensive to get a 4-year degree. And so this CCP makes it easier so people can afford to graduate. So, yeah.
All right. Speaking of institutions, story number 3. A Philadelphia institution.
You are so good with the transitions. Oh, my goodness.
Is back, folks. I'm talking about Will Smith.
Yay.
Yay? Okay, so there's your opinion on Will Smith. I guess he's become a lightning rod now, but Will Smith announced yesterday that his first album in 20 years will drop on March 28th. That's just in 10 days, Cherry.
Countdown is on.
This new album is called Based on a True Story. And crucially, for our purposes, it features a photo of him in a Phillies cap and a Phillies jacket on the cover, suggesting he's sort of coming back to his roots. Will Smith, he's doing music again for the first time in a long time. He's repping Philly on the cover. I mean, he's not Hollywood Will Smith anymore, Cherry. He's Phillies.
West Philadelphia.
West Philadelphia's. And by the way, this comes after it was recently announced that they're going to rename a block in West Philly Will Smith Way.
Yeah. And I mean, he has kept a really low profile since the infamous slap 3 years ago. Can you believe it was 3 years? But, what do you do when you get knocked down? What do you do when you make a mistake? You go home. And you go back to your roots, as you said. You start where it all began, which is Philadelphia and music, because that's what made him famous in the first place.
100%. And by the way, a lot of famous collaborators on this album, but that I was very happy to see that he is going to collaborate with DJ Jazzy Jeff.
Yes.
The original, that was the original
OG, and he
duo.
was on Studio 2, by the way. DJ Jazzy Jeff came
Let's
to
make sure
celebrate
we make it about us a little bit there.
50th
Just a little bit.
anniversary.
He did, yeah.
He did. And so
he
we are
was
fans
great,
of
by
that.
the way.
He
A
was
fantastic guest.
Yeah, and by the way, the names of some of the songs, Beautiful Scars, Tantrum, Work of Art. I think it's going to be I listened to a couple of the songs in preparation for today, and I think it's kind of cathartic. He's been through some things.
Okay.
Will
I
Smith
liked,
has.
there was a track there called Rave in the Wasteland.
Oh.
I want to know what that's about.
Yeah.
Where's the wasteland? Where's the rave? Can I get an invite?
You want to go to that rave. That's a rave to go to.
No, legitimately. His first big solo album was, I think, the first album I ever had.
Wow.
Yeah, the one with Getting Jiggy with it and Miami. Yeah. I mean, I was like 9 years old or so when it came out. So that's like when you're getting your first album. That was a huge album. I do think probably if you're a little younger than us, you would think of him solely as a movie actor and forget that he was like a legitimate pop star in his hip hop heyday.
And you got to remember, Fresh Prince and DJ Jazzy Jeff and the Fresh Prince got the first ever rap Grammy. So they're like history making.
History.
So, yeah.
We're going to talk about the history of higher education this hour. to try to frame this conversation about why universities seem to be in the crosshairs of the Trump administration right now. And we did ask the question earlier, have universities and colleges become too liberal? Because that is the claim on the right. And some people, Cherry, are already rejecting the premise.
They are.
Uno Clay on YouTube says, I appreciate you're trying to do legitimate journalism, but having any sort of both-sidism on this issue during the fascist takeover of our country is disappointing. Ooh. So perhaps you don't like the framing of this conversation at all. Maybe you think this is both-sidism. Do you think there's two legitimate sides here?
Yeah.
Let us know.
You know what, Clay, I appreciate that comment for sure. But call us.
We don't run away from it. 888-477-9499, Studio 2 at WHYY.org is where you go to send an email. And if you're like Clay on YouTube, drop a comment right there in the chat. We'll be right back on Studio 2. Don't go anywhere. And welcome back, everybody, to Studio 2. I'm Avi Wolfman-Arent.
And I'm Cherry Gregg. Colleges and universities across the country are struggling under several of President Trump's policies. In its earliest days, the administration threatened to slash millions of federal dollars from local research institutions like Penn and Rutgers. It's launched investigations into DEI and anti-Semitism on campus. This has left a lot of schools scrambling. But the focus on universities is not a surprise. Here's now Vice President J.D. Vance in a keynote address 3 years ago at the National Conservatism Conference.
I think if any of us want to do the things that we want to do for our country and for the people who live in it, we have to honestly and aggressively attack the universities in this country.
Attack the universities. Well, for decades, elite schools have been called liberal breeding grounds. Is that really true? We are going to debate that later in the hour, but first we want to bring in a perspective from a higher ed insider. So we're going to welcome in now Elaine Maimon, who spent over 13 years as a college president at Governor State University, University of Alaska Anchorage, and Arizona State West. She joins us now via Zoom. Elaine, welcome to Studio 2.
Well, thank you very much, Avi and Sherry. I'm glad to be here, and I really was happy that you talked about Community College of Philadelphia earlier in the segment. Very important institution in our area.
Absolutely.
So, Elaine, you led Arizona State West, and right now, Arizona State is on the list for a DEI investigation by the Trump administration. So I want you to take us behind the scenes of these federal funding cuts, these threats, these investigations that are happening right now. Hypothetically, of course, if you were in charge, how would you even begin to respond to what's happening?
Well, first of all, let me say I've been 24 years as the chief executive officer of the three institutions you mentioned. So it's a long experience across many parts of the country. If I were the head of Arizona State University West right now, what I would be doing would be trying very hard against all odds to do my job for students. And the challenges that are being put upon higher education by higher ed are actually disgraceful. Let me say that what I think is going on, and I think J.D. Vance's statement actually shows that, is that what we are seeing is a basically autocratic government moving toward dictatorship and wanting to destroy the guardrails that stop that. And two of the most important guardrails are universities and a free press. So that's what's going on. And I think that another thing they're doing is creating chaos, not only at Arizona State University West, Governor State, Cheney, Community College of Philadelphia, University of Pennsylvania, but everywhere. And it affects students. Because just on some matters that your audience may not be aware of, closing down the Department of Education so that there's nobody there to answer an email or to get any kind of question about, do I still have to pay my student loans because I just lost my job?
Yeah.
And of course, so many federal people have lost their jobs. So there is chaos everywhere, chaos and fear.
And that's why I want to know, Elaine, like, what would you actually be doing? You said do your job, but would you be having meetings? Would you be scrubbing your websites? We've seen universities actually take steps to remove words that mention DEI or even imply it. What would you actually be doing?
Well, the first thing I'd be doing would be to try everything I could to help and reassure the students on my campus, because they are very confused and fearful about the help that they get from Pell Grants, which are the scholarships that you don't have to pay back and so forth. Of course, I'd be having meetings with staff and trying to figure out what we can do to preserve our value system. In terms of the whole scrubbing of websites and so forth, I think there, again, the administration has put universities in a really difficult position defying the First Amendment. Yeah. I mean, can you imagine if just a private citizen stood up at a school board meeting and used the terms diversity, inclusion, and equity, and then some federal person said, we're going to fine you $100 for saying that? Yeah. That would be so clearly a First Amendment sin. Whereas universities being told, you use these words on your websites and we're going to come and take your federal money away. What is going on? So, of course, I would try to, first of all, articulate our principles and values and do whatever I could do to preserve those within the kind of attacks that we are experiencing.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you, Elaine, I think that brings up the question of what do you compromise on, and you know, where do you acquiesce and where do you hold the line? Because I would understand if you're the president of a university sitting there looking at your budget saying, I can't afford to lose X million number of dollars. That's going to hurt the students we serve. So, you know, where do you draw the red line?
Well, I think that what you do is that you have to be practical, but at the same time, you have to find another way of articulating and enacting your values. Mm-hmm. So let me give you an example of my alma mater, which is the University of Pennsylvania. They have a target on their back. And, you know, they weren't included in this latest round of 50 schools, but they clearly have a target. So they're looking at some language changes on their websites, but at the same time, they have made it so that families that have incomes up to $200,000 will have free tuition and fees at Penn. They also have made it so that families that have incomes up to $75,000 are going to have everything covered: books, travel, everything. Now that is inclusion and equity in action. And
so do the work, but try to sort of avoid some of the scrutiny that comes with these trigger words.
Well, yeah, look, the trigger words, especially if you're target on your back, maybe you have to do something about them, but you have to be very clear about following through on the values.
And before we get you out of here, Elaine, just want to ask you, what do you foresee as like a worst case scenario over the next few years for the institutions that clearly have drawn the ire of the administration? Where do you see this potentially headed if it gets really bad?
Well, we have to stop it. We have to make sure that it doesn't happen, because one of the great values and benefits within the United States is that we have a higher education that is the envy of the world.
Yeah.
We have everything from community colleges to the Ivy League, and we serve students very well. I mean, I think that what has to happen is we have to use this moment in higher ed to focus what we're doing, to make sure that we communicate more effectively to audiences like the listeners to this program, the value of higher education for the full range of students here. And this whole question about the two-sidism that I heard one of your listeners bring up, that is just a wrong way to encapsulate things. You know, in my long experience in higher ed, what I've seen is, of course, you're going to see people, some people who are doing things excessively, doing things wrong in any profession. But for the most part, faculty and staff across this country at institutions of various definitions are concerned with helping students find their own voice. That's what we're about. Not indoctrinating students. And so I think we have to do a better job of getting that message across. And I think if we do, we'll get the support from the public that we need and deserve.
Well, thank you very much, Elaine, for that commentary. We appreciate your time on Studio 2.
Well, thanks very much. And by the way, I taught at Haverford College very early in my career.
Go Black Squirrels. Thank you, Elaine. That was Elaine Maimon, former college president and current advisor to the American Council on Education. She's also the higher education columnist at the Philadelphia Citizen. So now we're going to, go a little broader on this issue. Let me read a couple comments before we do. Rude Diego on YouTube says, universities teach critical thinking. I can only talk about my experience, but going to Temple and the Fox School of Business exposed me to both liberal and conservative ideals. Diversity is Temple's greatest strength. And then here's Ellen, who says, higher education has been in the crosshairs of the GOP for years, being seen as dominated by the enemy, aka liberals, and their dissident ideas. More recently, it's viewed as a breeding ground for ideas that have inflamed the right, such as DEI, critical race theory, and so-called gender ideology. Pro-Palestinian campus actions have provided the Trump administration and its well-organized allies with a much-desired opening for attack. That's Ellen's perspective. And now let's bring in a couple more perspectives to guide us through the rest of this hour. Joining us in the studio right now is Jonathan Zimmerman, professor of the history of education at the aforementioned University of Pennsylvania. Jonathan, thanks for being here with us on Studio 2.
It's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yes. Also with us is Rick Hess, the director of education policy studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Rick, welcome to you as well.
Thanks. Good to be with you.
And to our listeners, our question of the day is this: have universities become too liberal? We'd love to hear your thoughts. You can call 888-477-9499. You can email studio2@whyy.org. And if you're watching on YouTube, be sure to drop your comment in the chat.
Let's start with a little history, Jonathan. So this idea that the academy, that higher ed, the ivory tower, is dominated by left-wing thought, that dates back to about when? From what I've read, it feels like mid-20th century. Is that about right?
Well, I would say even earlier, because universities have always been a threat to people with power, either private power or public power. So here we are at WHYY in Philadelphia talking about the University of Pennsylvania. Several fellow faculty members who were themselves conservative everyone was compared to Nearing, defended him unsuccessfully. But the head of the psych department was a guy named Lighting Whitmer, which is a great name. We don't name people that anymore. And he said, I don't agree with anything that Nearing has to say, but I've got to stand up for what he has to say, or then it might be me.
So you're talking about a single case from the early part of the 20th century. But this idea, I think the idea that it's become like an animating force on the right, that the academy has been corrupted by liberal thought. Does it date back to then, do you believe, or do you think it has more gathered steam in recent years? Give us a sense of that timeline.
Well, look, I think that, first of all, during wartime, especially the First and Second World War and the Cold War, people that criticized the war effort, who were mostly on the left, were targets. One of the great myths, I think, about academic freedom in this country is that it's protected professors who criticized the war effort, because in the First and the Second World War, it absolutely did not. There were dozens of professors who lost their job. But it did attract people who were broadly on the left. And of course, that raised hackles on the right. So think about a figure like William F. Buckley. In 1951, when Buckley was still an undergraduate at Yale, he published God and Man at Yale. And the thesis of that book is that the Yale faculty was dominated by people who were both, he thought, anti-religious and also pro-Keynes, that is, pro-liberal economics. He thought that the faculty should be teaching what he called Christianity and capitalism. So that critique goes back 70 or 80 years.
Yeah, that's a long time.
Yeah, and I think about this, though, and Rick, I want to bring you into the conversation as well. So if there was this distrust of universities and colleges that dates back well over 100 years at this point, why did the federal government sort of make these types of investments where we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars at this point going to one individual university? Why did the government lean in, whether it be Republican or Democrat?
There's a bunch of reasons. After World War II, we made the decision, unlike a number of other nations, to build out a research infrastructure on campus. That's why you had these incredibly high overhead rates to help institutions hire administrators and build buildings. One of the frustrations you've seen play out earlier this year is usually when you invest in what they call capital stock, buildings, infrastructure, over time the costs come down as things get built out. In the case of higher ed, the costs have gone up over the last 80 years. But look, whether we're talking about Pell Grants, student loans, higher ed has been a bipartisan cause in the United States for, better part of 75 years. What it took to keep that going, though, was at least some vague effort on the part of higher education to present itself as something other than a political project, to argue that it was a place where students learned useful skills, that made an effort to give the nation a reasonable return on investment, that it was a place that would welcome institutionally free inquiry and asking hard questions from any direction. And I think the concern on the right is that over the last 10 or 15 years, higher education has in large part, not community colleges, not two-year institutions, but four-year institutions and especially elite higher education have walked away from that project, that they have explicitly taken sides in political and ideological fights, that academic associations have made themselves activist arms in political and ideological debates. And when higher ed ceases to try to operate as an institution separate from politics and allows its institutional platforms and its organizations and its associations and its most visible members to wade straight into political and ideological conflict, you become part of the political scrum.
Let me read this email from Patrick, who says, I am a graduate student in history and have taught many classes. While most of my colleagues lean left, I think people underestimate how many conservatives and libertarians are in academia and how right-leaning most boards of trustees are. We brought up Yale earlier. I wanted to read this little data point from the Yale Daily News, which is the campus newspaper. They did a survey of students during the 2024 election, the run-up, and 82% of students said they were voting for Kamala Harris. 8% who responded said Trump. The Yale Daily News also reported that 98% of professors who donated in that cycle donated to Democratic candidates or groups. So, Jonathan Zimmerman, between Patrick's comment and that statistic I just read out, do you feel like some part of academia has become deeply ideologically slanted, or is that an oversimplification?
Look, I think the data is pretty clear, and the data I'm going to refer to now comes from FIRE, the organization that's about 2 blocks from where you are.
It's a free speech organization.
Yeah, and what they do is they do these very, very in-depth surveys of college students, and they ask questions like, do you feel at liberty to express what you think in class or with your peers? And large numbers of students say no. Now, in fairness, right, I think that too many of us want the students who agree with us, no matter what it is we think. It's actually much easier to teach that way.
For your fellow professors.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. And let's also remember that especially at the elite universities, you are not rewarded for your skill or your success in teaching. The reason I'm at the University of Pennsylvania is because of what I've published.
Publish or perish, right?
Plain and simple. I'm now in my 8th year. Nobody at Penn with any administrative authority has ever come to observe me in my classroom to see what I'm doing. I could tell you there have been administrators in my classroom, but they're people I've invited to interview them with my students. Nobody has ever come to supervise me, right? Or to check on how well I'm doing this. Now, you might say, well, what does this have to do with what we're talking about? I think it has a lot to do with what we're talking about, because if you're not actually invested in teaching, you won't be invested in that ideal of each student kind of finding their own voice or figuring out what they think.
So you think there have been some missteps from the left here?
Absolutely. And even though we are under enormous fire, some of which I think is unfair, I don't think it's the moment to circle the wagons and say that everything we've done is peachy keen. That's not going to convince anybody.
Yeah, and I want to bring in a caller. We have Gary from Philadelphia on the line. Gary, you are on Studio 2. What's your question or comment?
Well, my comment is sort of threefold. One is, of course, most students and most universities tend to be moved to the liberal or left because they read, they're informed, they're not taken in by the right-wing Fox and other right-wing social media. But in terms of really who controls universities, all you have to look at is who's on the board of trustees. Follow the money. The buildings are named after right-wing, big wealthy people. So the universities themselves are very much right-wing, not at all left-wing. Basically, what's happening is this is straight out of the autocrat playbook. It's what Orban does, what every dictatorship does. First thing you do is crack down on media. The second thing you do, or at the same time, which is what they're doing now, is crack down on universities, where people are actually thinking for themselves. And it's exactly what this fascist takeover is doing.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gary. So let me put that to you, Rick Hess, because I did take a little survey of who the buildings are named after at Penn, because I knew Jonathan was coming on. I mean, this is just a small sample. Dinnan Hall, hedge fund manager. Fisher Bennett Hall, New York real estate titan. The Carey Law School, prominent real estate family. Vernon and Shirley Hill Pavilion, founder of Metro Bank. Holman Biotech Commons, hedge fund manager. John Huntsman Hall, major chemical company. I mean, a lot of people on the left say, wait a second, who controls the narrative here? Look who's endowing the chairs. It's the people from sort of the commercial capitalist right.
And so buildings on campus are generally built by rich people. Poor people, I don't have any money to give a campus to build anything. Two, I don't know the politics of the people you just named. Up until about 2023, in fact, one of the extraordinary frustrations on the right was the degree to which the billionaire class was embracing, left-leaning cultural agendas. So, you say those names. I don't know what that means.
Well, I think it's supposed to be a contrast, but the idea that these are somehow sort of controlled by like sort of socialist thought leaders, that like when you actually get into the heart of the academy, the people really in control of the agenda are people with money and status and privilege. You don't think that's true at all, Jonathan?
I think that's absolutely true, but I think some of those people are Democrats, and they always have been. And this, too, takes us back to the Cold War, because during the Cold War, interestingly, people like Bill Buckley expressed enormous frustration with titans with names like Ford and Carnegie, because they said these people are sort of enabling this kind of
conversation, that one of the frustrations that you have heard voiced by folks in higher ed is, for instance, that the Trump administration is using the Office of Civil Rights, that they issued what we call a Dear Colleague letter, informal guidance relating to the enforcement of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, in which they argue that number of practices that are performed under DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, run afoul of the plain language of Title VI, and that they create a hostile learning environment around conditions related to race, ethnicity, or religion. So, for instance, there's an argument that practices which exclude students from some opportunities on the base of race or ethnicity are civil rights violations, and that colleges have to address that. So they are doing this. There's a lot of room for good faith conversation about how this kind of civil rights enforcement works, how to think about it. For instance, there should be a clear line drawn that civil rights enforcement is about institutional behavior. It's not about what gets discussed in classrooms, what books get read, what happens under the purview of kind of curriculum instruction. So there's that. But the other thing that's getting lost here, and for instance got lost...
We are coming up on a break real quick. Rick, do you want to finish that point?
The other thing that's getting lost is that this approach to civil rights enforcement was pioneered by the Obama administration.
Okay.
When they issued their famous Dear Colleague letter on Title IX enforcement in President Obama's first term, when they told colleges that you need to change the way that you address sexual harassment allegations on campus. You've got to eliminate due process. You've got to adopt a 50.1% likelihood of guilt standard. That there was a series of requirements imposed without law, without formal rulemaking by the administration, to which higher ed writ large said, fine, we're cool with this.
Thank you.
Part of the issue here is
we got to go to break.
You're saying there's a double standard. That's Rick Hess, Director of Education Policy Studies at AEI. We're talking with Jonathan Zimmerman as well from the University of Pennsylvania. Much more to come on Studio 2. Stick with us.
Welcome back to Studio 2. I'm Cherry Gregg.
And I'm Avi Wolfman-Arent. Hey, if you're just joining us, we're talking about what's happening at colleges and universities across the country. Many are at risk of losing millions in federal funding, more than 50.
Keep those comments coming in the chat. And Rick, right before we left off on our break, you were basically giving your thoughts about DEI. You made the argument that DEI went too far when it comes to universities. Do you want to complete that thought? And then we'd like to give Jonathan a chance to respond. Rick, go ahead.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I mean, I think lots of influentials, lots of my good friends on the left will concede that DEI lost control of its, DEI advocates lost control of what they were doing. Look, I don't know anybody, right or left, who doesn't want higher ed to be inclusive, who doesn't want every student to feel welcome or like they belong. I know lots of folks, right and left, almost everybody, who says, of course we want institutions that, like John said, welcome diverse thought. The point is that a number of the practices that took root under DEI, the privilege walks and privilege worksheets, the labeling of students as oppressor or oppressed based on complex kind of work-throughs of intersectionality, the race-conscious practices, the race-based affinity groups where you would gather students who are Black or Latino and white together, practices that came straight out of the Jim Crow South. The arguments that these are not only morally problematic, but in many cases violate the meaning of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act.
And thank you for...
That's what we need to address, not get back to the core intuitions.
Yeah. And Jonathan, you wanted to respond. Could you agree with some of what Rick
Look,
had to say?
I mean, I think DEI has been complicated, and I agree with Rick that the principles are unarguable, but what my former student Jeff Snyder calls DEI Inc., that is the huge bureaucracies that we made around the subject, I think some of them didn't actually accomplish Title IX and the way that sexual assault was addressed. But at that time, you didn't see universities going through their websites and scrubbing them of words. I'm sorry, man. That's what happens in authoritarian countries, not in democratic ones. And what the new orders have at least been interpreted to require is precisely that: is a kind of a radical kind of censorship of language. I know we've made that mistake before. I don't want to repeat it.
Yeah, and I want to read this comment from Lisa, who says, "This is an existential threat to higher education. Other issues are manufactured to cover the greater cause of silencing anyone who doesn't agree with their ideology or wants to think for themselves." And so I'm thinking about the solutions, the executive orders to end DEI, all the threats to investigate. And I'm wondering, yes, even if there is a problem, Rick, at higher education institutions, even if they went too far with DEI, will having these threats, snatching funding, is this really going to fix things?
It can. I mean, it depends how it's done. The American Association of University Professors, a left-leaning organization of academics, reported in 2022 that half of all large colleges and universities were requiring DEI statements in order to be considered for tenure or promotion. These statements were essentially pledges to a series of ideological positions. Look, if the administration is saying you've got to get rid of DEI loyalty oaths, you're not allowed to make race-conscious determinations about who is eligible for scholarship programs. You're not allowed to have institutional positions in which you're labeling some of your students as oppressors or victims based on protective categories under the Civil Rights Act. I think that it creates a healthy opportunity. Now, some
of the threats and some of the requirements go beyond the law. I mean, there's no argument. They've gone well beyond the law. And in
scrubs, I'm actually not sure they're required. What's happening is just like has tended to happen with other Dear Colleague letters, is higher ed and K-12 administrators are doing their darndest not to get caught in the crosshairs of federal investigation or federal punishment. And what that does is it creates a lot of uncertainty about what's actually being demanded and where are they overreacting.
It's having a chilling effect, but it sounds like it's having a chilling effect.
Yeah, I believe the abbreviation is CYA, but I can't say those three letters on air. Or one of them, one word I can't say on air. Craig says, I'm often impressed by my college students where I find serious young people who have a strong... Craig says, I'm often impressed by my college students where I find serious young people who have a strong work ethic, share one another's burdens through teamwork, and are kind and respectful. Would not qualities like these also be desirable to anyone on the right? And I want to use that as a springboard to ask you, Jonathan, about the broader state of higher ed, because we have laser focused in on stuff around DEI, anti-Semitism, but a lot of people step back and say, wait a second, this system still produces some of the best research in the world. Students from all over the world still want to come to these schools. I mean, how far off track could they have possibly really gotten here? Are we making a mountain out of a molehill. Your thoughts?
Well, I want to find a register here between Pollyanna and doom scroll. Right? So I'm not going to sit here and say,
that's the place we all want to be, by the way. Yes.
Everything is totally fine. Stop worrying. But I also don't want to say the sky is falling everywhere. Look, Rick mentioned Columbia, and I should say I'm not unbiased about this. I'm a graduate of Columbia, and it is outrageous what's happening at Columbia. Absolutely outrageous. Here's why. The basic principle of a liberal society and a liberal university, it's pretty simple. It's free speech and due process of law. And those two principles have been flouted radically at Columbia and other places. We've seen federal agents arrest a student with a green card, now an ex-student, giving no indication of any law that he's violated. The same for another student who ran away to Canada. We've seen the federal government order Columbia to put 3 departments into receivership, which means in real English that they can't make their own calls on who they hire. And to the due process point, there's absolutely no explanation of the process itself. Think about the $400 million reduction.
Sure.
Why not $300 million? Why not $500 million? Who the hell knows? None of us know. And that's, I believe, deliberate. I think that ambiguity is deliberate.
Into the argument that this is really about sort of taking the system down or bringing it to bear so that the cultural hegemony shifts to the right, that they sort of control these systems, they control academia. Mm-hmm. Do you think there is truth to that argument from the left, that what they're trying to do is similar, for instance, to what Orban has done to higher education in Hungary?
Again, I'm trying to find a place in between, right? I don't think we're at the Viktor Orban place yet. But I do think it's fair to say that the events of the past 60 days, that there's a Venn diagram there, and with a dark space, and I choose
a little too much overlap for comfort.
Yes, and I choose my metaphors carefully here. You know, the absence of due process and the just brazen attacks on free speech, I don't think we have many precedents for those in our history. And to be honest, I'd like to see much more protest on campus about them. This is a question I keep asking my students. After October 7th, our campuses, including mine, they exploded in protest. Where's the protest now? To be fair, there has been some, but in an extremely minor key. I don't get that. I want people to raise their voice.
You think the students don't understand what's at risk here?
I'm not sure. Yeah. I think in some ways the Middle East and the Gaza thing is its own animal. I think the politics are extremely different. I think they tend to divide the left in ways that some of these other things we're talking about don't. So it's a hard comparison to make, but the empirical thing is obvious.
Yeah, and we have about 3 minutes left in the show, but I want to sort of zoom out. Where do we go from here? Because we have multiple comments from our listeners who say, look, higher ed has become way too dependent on federal funding. But at the same time, AI is becoming a real thing. We have climate disasters every single year, every other month, and we need big thinkers. So where do we go from here? What are some of your thoughts on the next steps? Should universities diversify more where they get their funding from? What should be the next steps? And I know we only have a couple minutes, but Rick, I want to ask you briefly, what do you think? Next steps?
Yeah, John and I have talked about this stuff a lot over the years. I don't think a lot of us are that far apart on this. Look, I think institutions got to get back to that core mission that John articulated at the beginning of our conversation. Right now, the stats you mentioned on the Yale faculty composition are not unusual. We need faculties that are inclusive, that welcome heterodox thinking from across the spectrum, that are focused on people who are great teachers, and research institutions on attracting and cultivating great scholars. We need to ensure that students are being welcomed, not because they know the right answers to give or because they went to the right high schools or had the right parents, but because we are aggressively welcoming a broad swath of students into our classes. We need to challenge students more.
Yeah.
We need to ensure that they are both spending more time doing scholarly work, more time reading, and more time engaging with people who think differently.
Yeah, and
I agree with that. And the only thing I'd add is the answer to a double standard is always a single one. So let's look at, the fact that the Republican Party had been complaining about cancel culture for years and years on our campuses. And now they're the cancelers in chief. That's what they're always the answer to a double one.
And let me end on this email from Rebecca, who says, I got degrees from the University of Virginia and UCLA, both in English, and I never, not once, was told what to think. Instead, I was taught to ask questions. Questions are at the heart of practically every college discipline. And thank you for answering our questions today, Rick Hess, Director of Education Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Appreciate your time, Rick.
Hey, good to be with you.
And Jonathan Zimmerman, Professor of the History of Education at the University of Pennsylvania. Always a pleasure to have you, sir.
Thanks. It was fun.
By the way, we are coming up on the second anniversary of Studio 2, and to celebrate, we want to turn the show over to our loyal listeners. So pitch us your show ideas, and if your show is selected, we'll produce a show on it during the first week of April.
Wow. That's cool. Studio 2 at WHYY.org, or leave a voicemail 215-351-0525. Studio 2 produced by Debbie Builder, Paige Marie Besser, Andreas Coast, Mike Schiffler, visual producer Al Banks and Tina Caliquet, engineered today's show, executive producer Kevin McCory. I'm Avi Wolfman-Arendt.
And I'm Cherry Gregg. Thanks for listening.
And tomorrow at noon, live local sports coverage, one of the last things remaining that kept people tied to their cable subscriptions. But the cord-cutting holdouts may finally be able to break up with cable for good, thanks to an announcement today that Peacock will allow live streaming of games from NBC Sports Philadelphia.
The question is this the end of cable television? We'll discuss it tomorrow on Studio 2. But coming up next, Here and Now, right here on WHYY. See you on the radio tomorrow.